Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a topic that, well, it touches every corner of the globe, doesn't it?
It really does. Global wealth distribution. It impacts billions of lives.
Absolutely. And it's more than just, abstract numbers on a page. It's really about who gets opportunities, who doesn't.
And the stability of the societies you interact with every single day.
Right. And it feels like it's constantly in the headlines right now, too.
It certainly is. From policy debates to social movements, how wealth is spread out or concentrated, it's a fundamental indicator.
Yeah, not just of economic health, but maybe social well-being, fairness.
Exactly, those two.
So our mission here in this deep dive is basically to sift through this big stack of source material we've gathered.
Reports from places like Credit Suisse, the OECD, World Bank, IMF, the World Inequality Database.
Plus specific government stats, Iceland, Singapore, loads of studies, even commentary like that X-Thread survey data.
Quite a mix.
Yeah, and we want to pull out the most important bits, the surprising facts, and sort of give you a shortcut to understanding this really complex landscape.
And these sources, well, they definitely paint a picture of some significant challenges.
Oh, definitely. The scale of wealth inequality in many places is pretty stark when you look at the numbers.
It is, but, and this is important, I think, they also offer some genuinely surprising insights.
Right, and they challenge some common assumptions like whether high inequality is just inevitable.
Yeah, is it just how modern economies have to work? The sources suggest maybe not.
So we'll look at the global picture, zoom into specific countries, look at the drivers, the factors behind the gaps.
And explore some examples that, honestly, might make you rethink what's possible.
Okay, so setting the stage, wealth distribution. What are we actually talking about?
Well, essentially, it's how all the assets in an economy,
Yeah.
cash, property, stocks, investments, everything, how it's all spread across the population.
And understanding that spread is key. So according to these sources, the scale globally is, frankly, it's staggering.
It really is. The most common stat you see, like from the Credit Suisse reports, is that the richest 1% of people
Just 1%.
now own something like 45% of all global wealth.
45%. Wow.
Think about that. Less than 1 in 100 people control nearly half of everything.
And on the flip side, the other end of the spectrum.
The bottom half, the poorest 50%, they collectively hold about, what is it, just 1% of the world's wealth?
1%.
Yeah.
That gap is, it's hard to even visualize.
Yeah.
And it must have real consequences, right? It's not just numbers.
Oh, absolutely not. The sources link high inequality pretty closely to social instability.
Okay. Like what?
Remember the protests in Chile back in 2019? Some sources mention those were partly fueled by sheer frustration over economic disparity. It creates friction.
Yeah, you can see how it would. And it seems to really freeze opportunity too, doesn't it? Like
Yeah.
cement people in place.
Exactly. There was an OECD study mentioned, I think, showing that in more unequal countries, kids are significantly less likely.
How much less likely?
About 20% less likely, it said, to climb the economic ladder higher than their parents.
Wow. So it really does lock people into where they started.
That difficulty in what they call upward mobility is a major theme across the sources, yeah.
So if we zoom in a bit, look at specific countries, the U.S. comes up a lot.
It does. Federal Reserve data, for instance, indicates the top 1% in the U.S. hold roughly 35% of the nation's wealth.
35%. And that's tens of trillions of dollars we're talking about.
Huge sums. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans, collectively, hold just about 2.5%.
2.5% for half the population. The sources really point to specific policy choices driving that, don't they? Like taxes.
They do. They often note how wealth earned from investments, capital gains from selling stocks or property.
Right.
That's often taxed at a much lower rate, maybe around 20% compared to the top rates on wages, which can be closer to 40%.
So that structure inherently benefits people who earn most of their money from assets, not salaries.
Precisely. And that widens the gap further.
And looking beyond the U.S., places like Brazil, South Africa are mentioned frequently.
Yeah, and the sources often explicitly connect today's disparities to really deep historical roots.
Legacies of colonialism, apartheid, things like that.
Exactly. South Africa, for example, consistently ranks as one of the most unequal societies globally.
What do the numbers look like there?
Well, World Bank data from 2023 put its Gini coefficient, that's the standard measure, where 0 is perfect equality, 1 is perfect inequality.
Right.
South Africa was at 0.63. That is extremely high.
And does that high inequality actually hurt the economy itself?
Seems like it. The IMF even links higher Gini coefficients to slower economic growth, so it suggests inequality isn't just unfair, it's an active drag.
Okay, so the picture's pretty grim in many places, but it's not the same everywhere, is it? How do other regions compare?
Well, Europe, for instance. Generally, countries there show more equitable systems than the US, but there are still significant disparities.
Even within Europe.
Oh, yeah. The World Inequality Database points to France, for example. The top 10% there own over half the nation's wealth.
Half the wealth of the top 10.
Yeah.
And that's likely a factor in some of the social tensions we've seen there recently.
Very likely, yeah. And the UK, the sources say its wealth gap has widened since about 2010.
How does that play out?
Well, places like the Resolution Foundation highlight this stark contrast between, say, wealth accumulating among London's elite
Right.
and the struggles faced by working-class families in more rural areas. And it's not just numbers. Eurostat data showed over 1 in 5 Europeans feel economically excluded.
Wow, 1 in 5. That must impact trust in society institutions.
Definitely. But then, here's where it gets interesting and maybe challenges some perceptions.
Okay.
The Scandinavian countries, they're often held up as different models, right? And the data seems to back that up.
Like Norway, Denmark.
Exactly. They have some of the lowest Gini coefficients globally, down around 0.25 to 0.27, according to OECD data.
0.25 compared to 0.63 in South Africa.
Yeah.
That's a massive difference.
It's dramatic.
So what are they doing differently? What policies do the sources credit?
It seems to be a combination of things. High levels of progressive taxation are key.
Meaning the more you earn, the bigger percentage you pay.
Exactly. Top rates in Denmark can exceed 50%, and this funds really robust welfare systems.
Universal access to healthcare, education, social services, that kind of thing.
Precisely. And Norway, of course, has its massive sovereign wealth fund.
Right, from the oil revenues, worth over $1 trillion.
Yeah. And the sources note that the fund's profits are essentially redistributed indirectly through the state providing those universal benefits.
So it's a system designed to share the resource wealth widely, not let it just concentrate in private hands.
It is. And that directly pushes back against the idea that huge wealth concentration is just inevitable in a successful economy.
Okay, so moving beyond specific examples, what are the underlying forces driving these gaps? According to the sources, what are the big levers?
They consistently point to, broadly, 3 main drivers: the economic system itself, government policies, and social structures.
So the basic economic framework, capitalism, social democracy, etc., that really matters.
Absolutely. An NBER study, for instance, highlighted that market-based capitalist economies, while great at driving growth, do tend towards wealth concentration if left unchecked.
And we see that in the U.S. data.
Yeah, since about 1980, the top 1% share of wealth has roughly doubled, while wages for the bottom half have basically stagnated, adjusted for inflation. The system itself can generate these disparities.
Whereas systems with, say, a stronger social democratic element actively use policy to push back against that tendency.
Exactly. They prioritize wealth redistribution through things like taxes and social spending. They aim for a baseline of well-being and opportunity for everyone.
Like in Denmark again.
Right. The WHO reports that in countries like Denmark, pretty much all citizens have access to quality healthcare and education. That levels the playing field significantly.
And specific government policies beyond the overall system are huge too, right? Tax havens came up.
Oh, definitely. The ICSJ, the investigative journalists, they've reported on the immense wealth hidden offshore.
Trillions of dollars, potentially.
Trillions, yeah. Estimated in places like the Cayman Islands. And lax regulations there allow that wealth to avoid taxes back home.
Which obviously makes inequality worse in the countries where the money was actually made.
Directly. Conversely, you have places like Finland using highly progressive taxes, top rates near 50%, as a deliberate tool to reduce inequality. Policy choices matter hugely.
And then there are the social factors. Education access seems critical.
It really is. A UNESCO report noted, for example, in rural India, a significant chunk of kids lack access to good schooling.
Creating disadvantages right from the start.
Yeah. Exactly. Which contributes to wealth gaps later. Oxfam research points to the top 1% in India holding over 20% of the wealth there, and these systemic factors play a big role.
What about culture? Do beliefs about wealth matter?
Seems so. The whole American dream idea, celebrating individual success, is strong in the U.S.
Sure.
But interestingly, a Pew Research poll showed a majority of Americans actually believe the economic system is fundamentally rigged in favor of the wealthy. A real tension there.
And the idea of pure meritocracy gets challenged, too.
Yeah, Forbes reporting suggests a pretty substantial percentage of billionaires inherited significant assets. It's not always just about starting from scratch and pure effort.
Okay, so given all these factors, the systems, policies, social elements, and the often stark numbers, let's circle back to those surprising examples you mentioned. Iceland, Singapore.
Right. Iceland is remarkable. Statistics Iceland data shows a Gini coefficient down around 0.24, among the lowest anywhere.
0.24. How? Similar formula to Norway and Denmark.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
High progressive taxes, top rates over 45%, funding significant social spending.
How much spending?
Around 30% of their GDP goes into social programs, universal health care, free education,
And the results.
nearly universal literacy, high life expectancy. The sources really present it as proof that deliberate policy choices can create a fundamentally more equal society. It's not random.
And Singapore. That's often seen as more of a high-growth, maybe less traditionally welfare state model.
It is, which makes it fascinating. Their Department of Statistics shows their Gini coefficient has actually decreased over the last decade or so, even with strong growth.
How have they managed that?
Targeted government initiatives seem key. There's something called the Workfare Income Supplement.
What's that?
It provides direct cash grants to low-income workers to boost their earnings, and also, a huge percentage of Singaporeans live in public housing.
HDB flats, right,
Mm.
which keeps living costs down.
Significantly. So while they pursue growth, they also have these specific programs designed to ensure a baseline of support and opportunity. It's a different approach, but also seems effective in managing inequality.
So it really does sound like policy can make a difference.
Mm.
But are there bigger, maybe global trends working against these efforts sometimes?
The sources definitely suggest that. Globalization gets mentioned, but especially technology, automation.
How is automation widening gaps?
Well, McKinsey research, for example, indicates automation is displacing more low-skill jobs than high-skill ones.
Right.
So wealth tends to concentrate more among those who own the technology or have the skills to work with it.
Okay. Ultimately, though, the sources keep reminding us this isn't just academic. There are real human stories here.
Absolutely profound human stories.
Right.
Take Brazil, for example. IBGE reports highlighting the vast difference
Like what?
between average earnings in a favela, maybe just a few $100s a month compared to the top 1%, averaging tens of thousands.
And that translates directly into different lives, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Access to healthcare, education.
Totally different realities. It perpetuates cycles of poverty.
Or in the U.S., you mentioned the IRS data. A single mother working 2 jobs, maybe earning $30,000.
While the top 1% average well over $1 million. Her ability to save, invest, give her kids opportunities is just fundamentally constrained by that gap.
And it's systemic, not just individual bad luck.
Right. A World Bank study pointed out that globally, a huge percentage of kids born poor stay poor as adults. Inequality gets passed down.
And there's a critical perspective in some sources that really pushes back against the idea that these huge gaps are just meritocracy at work. You know, everyone ends up where they deserve.
Exactly. That view, they argue, often ignores massive systemic barriers. South Africa is maybe the starkest example.
How so?
Stats SA data shows the majority of Black citizens still live below the poverty line. The sources explicitly link that reality to the enduring legacy of apartheid structures, not some inherent individual failing.
And the tax haven thing comes back here too, right? Undermining fairness.
Definitely. Groups like the Tax Justice Network estimate billions, maybe trillions, hidden from taxation by the ultra-wealthy. That directly contradicts the idea of a fair system where everyone contributes their share.
So the scale of the challenge is huge. It's clear from the data. But
Mhm.
those success stories, Iceland, Singapore,
Mm.
they offer some hope.
They offer compelling evidence, I think, that deliberate, equitable policies can work. They can counteract that tendency towards wealth concentration.
But these newer global trends like automation, they are changing the game.
They are suggesting we might need new solutions, new thinking.
Which naturally brings up ideas like universal basic income, UBI.
It does come up. There was a Eurobarometer poll mentioned showing majority support for UBI among Europeans.
Really? Why do you think that is?
Well, perhaps it reflects a growing recognition that, the traditional job market and welfare systems might need rethinking, especially with these new forces potentially making inequality worse.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does all this mean for you listening to this deep dive? Why should you care?
Well, understanding global wealth distribution gives you essential context. for making sense of the world, really.
Yeah, the economic forces shaping markets, the social tensions driving headlines.
And just the vastly different lives people lead across the globe. It helps you understand the why behind a lot of what you see.
So we've journeyed from those stark global numbers, looked at the gaps in the U.S., Brazil, South Africa,
Contrasted them with more equitable systems like Norway, Denmark, Iceland, even Singapore's model.
and explored that mix of economics, policy, social factors driving it all.
It's clear there's no single magic bullet, right? But learning from all these different approaches gives us a lot to think about how societies function and maybe how they could function.
So the final thought to leave you with, while inequality is undeniably this major challenge right through all the sources,
The examples of countries that have actively implemented policies, progressive taxes, social spending, specific programs like workfare or public housing in Singapore.
they really challenge that fatalistic idea, don't they? That huge wealth gaps are just inevitable, unchangeable.
Exactly. The sources underline that your opportunities shouldn't be dictated by who your parents are or where you were born.
And maybe, with economies changing so fast because of tech and automation, ideas like UBI aren't just theories anymore.
Perhaps they're necessary explorations for the future. It all challenges us, I think, to consider what else this knowledge tells us.
Yeah, about how societies could be organized differently, about the choices that are actually being made.
And the potential for outcomes that look very different from those starkest numbers we started with. Lots to think about.